Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine. And we have an illuminating program for you this afternoon about the past, present, and future of free speech. But first, for those of you not familiar with how this virtual format works, let me explain that if you want to ask a question of our guests, you can do so by clicking on the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. The chat function also will be active, and in that column, you'll find a link for purchasing a copy of today's featured book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America by Ellis Cose. Here's a picture of the cover. Ellis is a longtime journalist who's worked for or contributed to such prominent publications as the Chicago Sun-Times, Detroit Free Press, New York Daily News, USA Today, and Newsweek and Time magazines. And he's the author of a dozen books on such subjects as immigration, race in America, reconciliation, and revenge. In his new book, Ellis tackles the issue of free speech. Now, Ellis and others like me who are of the same generation remember a time when the idea of free speech wasn't particularly controversial. I mean, after all, it's in the Bill of Rights and was long considered a fundamental feature of American democracy. The idea of free speech was rooted in certain beliefs that had become time-worn maxims, such as the way to fight bad speech is with more, not less speech, and the marketplace of ideas will result in the best arguments winning out. But times have changed, and free speech is no longer looked on so automatically by many as a bedrock principle. In an age like the current one that's become so ridden with persistent racism and deepening economic inequality, arguments about free speech have become more complicated. Too often it now seems bigots and other practitioners of hateful, hurtful speech are using free speech claims to hide behind, and too often free speech appears to be fostering the spread of misinformation or serving to secure the political influence of the wealthy. All this has raised questions about whether the traditional notion of free speech is somehow fatally flawed, whether it must now be balanced against other important societal values. Ellis examines these questions in his thoughtful, concise new book. In conversation with Ellis will be Eric Sterling, a lawyer who recently retired after more than 30 years as executive director of the Criminal Justice Policy Foundation, which is a nonprofit organization that helps educate about criminal justice issues and global drug policy. Eric himself has a long history dealing with free speech issues. Back in 1969, during a period of anti-war protests, he was acquitted on First Amendment grounds on charges of loitering and distributing unauthorized leaflets inside the Pentagon. Later, after graduating from law school, he served as assistant public defender in Pennsylvania, and then for a decade as assistant counsel on the House Judiciary Committee. So Ellis and Eric, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Bradley. It is a pleasure for, I think, both of us to join the Politics and Prose readers here this evening. And it's my great pleasure to talk with Ellis Cose about his new book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. You open the book, Ellis, writing about Charlottesville, Virginia, a sort of landmark event contemporaneously with free speech. What happened in Charlottesville that made you begin your analysis with those incidents?
Charlottesville was an interesting event because it brought together a lot of elements. It was a Unite the Right rally, which started that, and it was something spearheaded by a young white supremacist who had decided that their voices needed to be heard. And they decided to hold this rally in Charlottesville a couple, 3 years ago, I guess now. Yeah, and the cities, which respect the whole right of free speech, said, well, okay, you can hold your rally, but we want you to do it not in the Central Park, a park named for General Lee, Robert E. Lee, which has been recently changed to Emancipation Park. And one of the things that the Unite the Right people were upset about was that name change. They said you can't hold it there. They said you can hold it in another park, which is easier to police and not quite as centrally located, and where there's less likely to be trouble. And the organization behind Unite the Right said, no, we don't want to do it. We want to do it in where we want to do it. And they went to the ACLU, which was another group, went to court and secured for them the right to hold it where they wanted to hold it, on free speech grounds. So this big rally is scheduled, and it was immediately obvious that trouble might be the result. There were hints of violence that accompanied the plans for the meeting. The University of Virginia, which is located in Charlottesville, warned its students not to come. Many merchants in the city itself decided to shut down for the day because they anticipated trouble. Virginia is an open carry state, and it was anticipated that weapons would be around and probably brandished. And lo and behold, the morning of the rally arrives, which is a Saturday morning, and there's chaos, and things became so crazy and so wild and so dangerous that the cops called off the meeting, the rally, before it actually occurred. And in the aftermath of them deciding to call it off, a young white neo-Nazi guy who was an admirer of Adolf Hitler plowed his automobile into a group of counter-protesters, killing one, injuring many others. And for the ACLU, this became a crisis because the ACLU was the organization that had, along with something called the Rutherford Organization, but the ACLU was the organization that had fought for this to be held. And within the ACLU itself, many people were saying, what in the world are we doing? Why are we wasting our time allowing or facilitating hate speech in America? And it was not a new issue for the ACLU. It was an old issue. It actually arose originally in the 1930s. And the ACLU had published a pamphlet called Why We Represent Nazis. And it arose again in the 1970s, 1978, when there was a march in Skokie, Illinois, which is a suburb of Chicago, which at that time housed a lot of Holocaust survivors. And there was another neo-Nazi group that decided that Skokie was a perfect place for them to march in Nazi regalia and hold a protest. And the ACLU, which by then had a long-standing position that free speech was more important than the content of the speech, defended the neo-Nazis, and they secured the right to speech. Well, the march itself never took place for reasons mostly having to do with the neo-Nazis who decided they'd rather have their march elsewhere. But the involvement of the ACLU caused another sort of crisis then. A lot of their supporters and Jewish groups were saying, what the world? And an occasion, a lot of people saying they were going to withdraw from the ACLU. A funding crisis resulted. And the ACLU decided it had to fight back. And it took a position which was articulated in what became a fundraising letter, which was sent out under the signature of David Goldberg, who was the chief lawyer on that case, who also was Jewish. And he wrote a letter which basically said, look, I don't like these guys any more than you do. In fact, I hate the Nazis so much, I'm not going to even capitalize the word Nazi in this letter. But let me tell you why I'm defending them. And I'm defending them because they are civil rights marchers in Selma at this moment. And Selma wants to ban those marchers exactly the same way that Skokie wants to ban these marchers. And if I agree that it's okay to ban these marchers and to violate their free speech grounds, I'm on very shaky ground when I go to defend the marchers in Selma. And that's been the long-standing ACLU rationale for taking these cases. We flash forward to the current time. It's a different ACLU. This ACLU has a racial justice function, which the original one did not have in the same way. Has many more members who are people of color, many more staff members who are people of color. And a lot of people within the ACLU itself were scandalized by this position. And so they ended up having a very painful internal dialogue about Why do you do this? And one of the arguments that emerged was essentially the same argument that emerged in the 1930s and that emerged in 1978, which was that if you get into the issue of deciding what content you can defend, and then you're on very shaky ground because that can ultimately turn around and bite you. But there was an internal soul searching. They decided as an organization they were not going to defend people who were threatening violence or when violence seemed to be imminent. There would be a more careful vetting, perhaps, of what groups they did actually decide to defend. A very painful process, which is still not totally over. But it raised a lot of questions that were not traditionally raised necessarily by advocates of free speech, which was, what do you do when you're dealing with free speech or speech that can potentially be harmful? And that set of issues has become much more salient in the current time when you have these.
So I wanted to, you brought up the question of speech that is harmful. And you use that term in your book. And I'm curious, what is the harmfulness of offensive speech we detest, that we disagree with? It's one thing, the classic instance of shouting fire in a crowded theater that is inciting or creating imminent danger, imminent hazard. We're going to march now. We're going to tear this down. We're going to start a fire. We're going to start a riot. How is that? And so that kind of incitement speech is prohibited. Speech that is not insightful, that is merely hateful, disparaging, contemptuous, false. Help us understand how that's harmful.
Well, the question really is, where do you draw the line? I mean, there have been certain types of speech going back. And first of all, let me say that one of the reasons I titled my book the way that it did, which is The Short Life of Free Speech, is that, as Bradley mentioned, I mean, free speech has been an American tradition. It came along right after the Constitution itself was ratified in 1791. So we had this idea floating around that speech ought to be free. But within that same decade, in 1798, you had the Alien Insurrection Acts, which basically...
And Sedition Acts.
Alien Sedition, what did I say? Anyway. Alien Sedition Acts, which basically invalidated the First Amendment. I mean, they made it illegal to speak out against the Federalist government. And you had newspaper publishers and others who were arrested for that. And so even going back to the time that we like to think of as this romantic era when there was this untrammeled free speech, it didn't exist. And even back then as well, it's worth noting that the amendment itself, which guarantees freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom to petition the government, the amendment itself speaks to rights that cannot be prohibited by Congress. In other words, by the federal government. So states themselves prohibited speech all the time. And particularly when it came to things like the abolition of slavery. You could not advocate the abolition of slavery in most southern states because it was illegal, and you could be arrested, you could be beaten or flogged, and you could be maltreated and ejected, and your newspapers would be burnt to the ground if you in fact decided to do that. So this whole tradition of speech, first of all, is relatively recent. It's really a creation of the 20th century.
And you really do a really good job of that. I was really impressed in the book how the famous statements that we attribute to Justice Brandeis were all in dissents, or these were concurrences where people were being convicted. Their right to speak wasn't being upheld in those cases in the 1920s.
No, there was a long journey to get there. I mean, one of the more famous cases was a 1927 case. Whitney v. California was a woman who was convicted in effect for belonging to the Communist Party. The actual charge is more complicated than that, but that was in effect what she was convicted of. Went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court upheld it. But in this famous concurrence, as you say, Brandeis and Oliver Wendell Holmes gave this glowing testament to the beauty of free speech, and the fact that the founders weren't afraid to give us free speech, and as Bradley mentioned earlier, this whole idea that bad ideas drive out good ideas, and that's the only way we can get to a society that is the best version of a democracy. So first of all, just that background is useful when we sort of understand this. The other thing that's useful, I mean, you talk about the imminent danger of speech, and for a long time that was a big standard within the law. If something was going to lead to imminent danger, then of course it was not allowed you were not allowed to have that kind of speech. But there were other sets of standards as well. I mean, in the 1940s there was a famous case which basically established fighting words as a bar to speech. That case, came about because a Jehovah's Witness had called a policeman fascist, and the policeman was so offended that he arrested the guy. He called him a fascist because he hadn't defended the guy who was proselytizing on the street. Was so upset that he arrested the guy. Again, this case ends up going up always to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court opposed it, and basically said, well, yeah, of course he was offended. These, you insulted him. These are fighting words. You can't use fighting words. So we have prohibitions over fighting words. We have had prohibitions over pornography, child pornography, at least. You cannot, exhibit freely child pornography.
Even other kinds of sexual related literature.
But the point, of course, is that we've always limited speech in one way or another, and we haven't necessarily adhered to the imminent and present danger standard when we've prohibited speech, where there have been other exceptions that have been made because we've just decided that we have a society where people have to in some way function and get along, and there are certain kinds of speech that are infringement upon that. We've had an ongoing debate about hate speech in this society as well. So you're right. Yeah, it's difficult and sometimes impossible to say, okay, this speech is going to lead to danger, so let's stop it. The other thing that's new in this debate is the existence of the internet,
right,
and the ability of the internet to serve as a cocoon for people who have hateful agendas, find each other, and decide that they are going to, in effect, sort of organize and mobilize each other across the internet, and to what extent that should be allowed, prohibited, monitored.
Why should that organizing be prohibited as opposed to any other kind of political organizing? I mean, on a content, knows if people are haters, will concede that that's their objective.
But that's a good question, and I think it's a question that internet providers are facing. I mean, there's a huge misunderstanding, first of all, about what the First Amendment does. It doesn't say that a private entity that hosts various types of conversations and organizations cannot have civility rules. What it says is that the government itself can't come in and willy-nilly tell people what to say and what not to say. So there's nothing to prevent the people who host these things from basically saying, look, there are certain types of hate speech that we just don't permit because they're in violation of our rules. You want to have that speech, you can have it, but you can't necessarily have it on our platform. And I think that's one of the big discussions that that's taking place and that needs to take place. And it's not, no one's arguing who's serious that we ought to pass laws that allows government to determine everything that's said on the internet. I don't think anybody who's thoughtful is an advocate for that. But I think the question that is raised is, how do you deal with this?
So if we think about Facebook or the other forms of communication, isn't there a way in which there's something like the telephone as a public utility, that if someone picks up the phone and calls somebody else who's a willing participant and they engage in hate speech on the telephone, that's not prohibited? And if they want to make it into a conference call, that's not prohibited. And if they want to plan to get together for a rally, or they can't plan to get together an assassination or a insurrection, but they can, of course, plan for meetings and advance their agenda. And that if they want to use Facebook to organize, when we've got, everything from, gardening clubs to student organizations, they're all using Facebook like a public utility as a way to carry out organizing. And so so I want to go back, and try to zero in on the harmfulness of the hate speech, that we would say this needs to be, a line needs to be drawn.
Well, I think first of all, I don't think you can do that way. I think you first of all have to acknowledge, even back in the 20s and the 30s when these original cases were being litigated, I mean, they tried to adhere to this present danger standard, but what in the hell does that actually mean? I mean, because as you say, in many of these cases, I mean, going back to the case that actually established that states were bound to obey the First Amendment by a complicated set of principles that came down to do with how they were incorporated into the 14th Amendment, but that's a whole nother discussion. But even back then, the case that determined that was two guys, who had, literature that they were, for a manifesto that they were distributing by tossing it out of their window. And the question was, and they got convicted, even as and that was a unanimous decision, or even as the Supreme Court extended free speech to the states. Now, the arguments that were made, even at that time, I'm sorry, it wasn't a unanimous decision. It was two dissensions on that, and one of them was Brandeis. But even as they decided that decision, one of the questions that was raised is, what's the imminent danger of these guys throwing these leaflets out the window? And is that going to lead to danger? Well, the argument made by the majority was, well, it sets an atmosphere for causing danger, and how do you separate that out? That's a difficult thing to do. It's an impossible thing to do, and I think that society decides, and not just the government, but society decides. Well, we go back to some kind of standard of civility. It's to what extent do we have valueless speech? And that's another issue we haven't gotten into. I mean, the fundamental rationale for having speech and for allowing it to be uncensored is that there is this belief that speech has value, and that you cannot really determine what valuable speech is until you hear it, and until it has a chance to make an argument. I think there is some speech that we can all agree has absolutely no value. I mean,
can you give an example?
Sure. Jews will not defeat us. What value does that have? I mean, that has no value in any way. Now, the question is, do we have a principle that allows us to say, well, we will allow that to be shouted from the rooftops because we don't want to censor people's ability to speak. But I challenge you to tell me what value shouting "Jews will not defeat us" or "niggers are bad." I mean, what value does that speech have? Explain that to me.
The value is the question is whether or not it's value to you or to me or to the vast majority of us.
No, murder has value to you if you want to kill somebody. So that's not the question. The question is, does it have value to society? I mean, you can't argue that if murder has value to you, then it should be permitted. So we have the similar question I think you can raise with speech. And the whole idea that by which we justify, what would have been called fighting words in another time, is because even if that particular speech doesn't have value, there's no way to sanction that or to prohibit that without prohibiting speech that does. And then that's the essential argument that the ACLU made in terms of defending Nazis. It's not that Nazi speech had value, because the standard can't be it has value to you. I mean, because that goes back to the old idea of, well, your rights end, where my face begins. Yes, you have a right to strike, to strike out you with your fist if you want to, but not if my face happens to be in that, in that space.
Well, to stay, it's not about striking out. I mean, I don't. What I'm trying to push you on and is, you very well quote, for example, one of the justices who says that essentially the ability to think requires, I think, the ability to speak, and that we, in order to protect then the ability to think, we protect the right to think. I'm paraphrasing the justice poorly from the way you quoted him in the book, and the example that you give is it Jews will not replace us, or people of color are bad. I mean, these statements, they, to say that they have no value is like, it is as akin to saying that novels have no value because they're artificial. They're not true. Or certain kinds of motion pictures, these things have no value because I don't get it. Abstract art, what's the value of a Jackson Pollock painting? I don't get it. I mean, there's a,
No, Eric, it's not the same. Even if I don't appreciate abstract art, there's no conceivable way, first of all, that it causes harm, and it clearly, is something that is very important and illuminates the world for other people, and so that does have value.
Harm. I want to understand then the harm, because that's No,
I wasn't saying. So you're making two different arguments, Eric.
I am.
So no, they're not hooked up necessarily. What the statement that I made was that you cannot say this speech has value. I think that if it does have value, then it automatically deserves a certain amount of protection. If it doesn't have value, then the question arises: do we need to really protect this speech, which has absolutely no value? And you can decide, yes, we need to do that. But you can't just convince me that this speech has value. And I'm saying that society has the right to decide that particular kinds of speech, because they have no value, they're going to somehow sanction, limit, or rule uncivil. And that goes back again, to the whole question of child pornography. Can you say that the mere existence of child pornography harms people? Well, that argument has been made, but you can say child pornography can be made in a way that it doesn't harm people. And if it's in fact made in that way, can you therefore argue it should be permitted? Well, you can make that argument. And if you can get enough people to agree with you, then the Supreme Court will probably say, okay. But the Supreme Court has obviously not agreed to that yet.
The argument with respect to the production of child pornography is that a child is actually harmed in the making.
No, I understand the argument, but I'm saying one can imagine a scenario under which child pornography can be made where the child will not be harmed. And I don't want to go into scenarios for that. But I mean, one can certainly imagine a scenario under which there can be certain types of child pornography where the child would not be harmed. And so then the argument becomes something other than whether or not the child is harmed. The argument then becomes whether or not this particular mode of expression has any value at all.
I'd like to return to your book and to you spoke about civility at one point, and it made me think of President Trump and the absence of civility. And you give a lot of discussion to how President Trump got elected, even though he lost the popular vote. You write about the inequality of the Electoral College and the inequality of the Senate. Would you like to share some more of that, given that a week from now we will be hearing the results of this ongoing election?
Yeah. Let's first of all talk about the Electoral College. I mean, back in the day when the Electoral College was formed, and we're talking about 1687, when the convention originally met to set up this Electoral College, America was a somewhat different place than it is now, and there was this idea, first of all, that most of the public didn't vote. Most of the public wasn't entitled to vote. You basically was a privilege of landowners, but it was also, and white landowners, and males, but it was also the idea that there was no mass communications, and as is now understood, and that most people wouldn't know who these candidates were, who was running for president, because the only person who was sort of universally known and respected was George Washington back then. And that since George Washington didn't want to be president forever, and then how were we going to decide who was going to be president once George Washington removed himself from the scene? And there was this notion embedded in the Constitution itself, and in the arguments that led to the Constitution, that you needed a group of wise men, wise white men, who would decide who was the president. And so this idea of the Electoral College came up, which was, and the idea was that this college of men, would be the filtering mechanism for allowing the best person to emerge. It was, again, before political parties were at all dominant in the way that they are now. And there were various mechanisms that they went through to sort of figure out how this was going to work. And at one point, there was this idea that that the men would meet and they would essentially pick between the best of the best men, and then they would decide who was the best person to be that. Well, we don't have anything like that. We have a system that's relegated largely to party hacks, where we don't have selectors selecting the best person. We have selectors who vote for the person who their party has obligated them to vote for. And what's made things worse in terms of the Electoral College is not just the Electoral College, it's the fact that all but 2 states in the nation have winner-take-all rules, which basically means that all the votes in one state go to the winning candidate. And those decisions have been made by state parties in the 48 states that allow that. So you have this situation as you do in the South, say for instance, where you have of the 106 largest population, majority Black counties in America, 105 of them are in the South. The only exception is St. Louis, and they're mostly in. They're mostly in red states because Black.
George's County, Maryland. I mean, unless Maryland is considered a southern state, I believe it's considered a majority Black county.
Yeah, of course, and there are 105 of them. As that most of them are in southern states. Until, and maybe this election will be different, but the effect of that is that you have whites who almost vote uniformly one way in those states when it comes to presidential elections. And so even though, Blacks may account for 40% of the population in some of those states, they never get a voice at all in the vote. There's something wrong with that. And there's something that undermines democracy when you have that kind of situation. And it's also, a problem because you have a situation now where you have red states, you have blue states, and so presidential candidates have no or very little incentive to even campaign in states that are not likely to go for them, as opposed to trying to pick up voters even in those other states. So you have a very unrepresentative system. And I think that in a nutshell is a problem. And to get rid of the Electoral College takes a constitutional amendment. To get rid of the winner-take-all system does not. And I think that's something that we need to look at as a society. But the Senate, I think, is even a worse problem. I mean, we just had a Supreme Court justice confirmed last week on the basis of a minority Senate. And when I say a minority Senate, I don't mean that she had the minority of the votes in the Senate. She did have a bare majority of those. But I'm saying that the Senate itself is so unrepresentative that you have a statistical reality now where 1/6 of the states have as much power as the other 5/6, because each state gets 2 votes.
1/6 of the population of the country.
1/6 of the population. Yeah,
in a majority of the states.
exactly. I'm sorry, I misspoke. But 1/6 of Americans have a veto power over the other 5/6, and they determine the selection of all federal judges and of appointments to the Supreme Court. And that might have made a certain amount of sense again back in the day when the size of Virginia, which was the largest state, was not all that much larger than Delaware. But it makes absolutely no sense now where, say, California is almost 70 times as large as Wyoming, and yet has the same number, the same representation. And also, because of the way this country has evolved, there are huge racial differences in the makeup of states. And so you give people from small, significantly less diverse states essentially veto power over what we can do as a society. That's something that I argue is anti-democratic. And to the extent you consider votes an expression of speech, it's a violation of the idea of equality and freedom of speech.
You make the point that speech really should be involved in one way in terms of protecting the republic, that speech should have a purpose, and that free speech in America should protect the republic. And if we were to propose a radical rewriting of the Constitution, and that the republic would be dramatically redrawn, perhaps there would be no Senate, a unicameral legislation that would all be based on representation. Or if there is a second chamber, that chamber would have to be representational, one person, one vote, just as the state senates around the country do. But to make those arguments require attacking the Constitution, attacking principles, rejecting the wisdom of the framers of the Constitution, at least as rejecting their lack of foresight, perhaps. But there could certainly be people who would argue that is very dangerous speech, harmful and undermine respect for the country and for the government, even if it serves the purpose that some of us would say is about spreading equal political power.
I don't think anyone would seriously make that argument. I mean, I think that, yes, you could make if I understand you correctly, what you're saying is that simply advocating those things, could be seen as harmful speech. And I think if you look at the arguments that justify freedom of speech, they are made specifically to counter the argument you're making now. What they basically argue is that you need to be able to challenge government, and that to the extent that you allow government to repress speech, and then you're getting into trouble with in terms of the whole concept of a democracy itself. So I don't think that the argument is that to advocate those things is to advocate the overthrow of the government. It's certainly within the Constitution itself. They would not have built in a mechanism for amendments if they didn't see the possibility that the Constitution itself would need to be changed. I do think because the process is so burdensome and difficult that we shrink from making changes that ought to be made. And I think also every situation advantages somebody, and there are states that are advantaged by the way that we operate now, particularly smaller states. So they have no real incentive to change to another system. And that does raise the practical question, of whether this can be accomplished or not. And when I say this, I mean changing the way that we elect senators, which is absolutely insane. I mean the very idea that a state that has 1/27th the population of another state should have the same voice in terms of governance of a country is a violation, clearly, of the one person, one vote principle. But because it's a bedrock principle of our Constitution, we allow that. I mean, one of the things I propose, somewhat tongue in cheek, is that okay, if we're so timid that we can't really contemplate changing the Constitution, let's change the states. Let's take some of these states like Wyoming and Nebraska, and move more people of color into them, move more young people into them. Have this a project of civil society to change the population. I mean, we once had a great migration where you had millions of people who left the South and fundamentally changed the cities that they moved to. Maybe that's what needs to happen again. Because it is so difficult to consider some of these changes. But I think we are having to confront some of these questions. I mean, the whole dialogue surrounding the justification of the most recent for the elevation of the most recent judge to the Supreme Court as a justice is, should we as a society be forced to live in a society where the third branch of government is headed by a court that is not at all representative of the American people, because one president in one time made a decision to appoint people for life. Should the next generation be forever burdened with the Supreme Court that is going to rule predictably in a certain way? That discussion is clearly going to be held over the next series of years, and if in fact there is a change in the presidency, Biden has already committed to having some kind of commission look at the federal judgeships, including the Supreme Court, and what can be done about that. And there are things that can be done about that. I mean, I think it's a rather defeatist view to say we have an extremely flawed democracy, but in 1687, some guys decided this was the kind of democracy we should have. Yeah.
1787.
Right. Decided that this was the kind of democracy we should have. So we're stuck with it forever. I don't think that makes much sense, and so I think these discussions are going to be held, and we'll see where they come out.
You also write about students and the lack of ability of students to analyze the information that they get in a sophisticated way. You're concerned about you expressed some of the concerns about restrictions on speech that develop on university campuses. Would you like to tell us anything about some of your analysis there?
Sure. Before I get into that, I just want to say that I think one of the problems we have with speech is that it's very imperfectly understood. It's very imperfectly understood what it means legally. We very imperfectly understand what the restrictions are on government, and the distinction between restrictions on government and restrictions on private actors, and what enables us to do and not do. And so as a result, you have things like, I was reading a Harris poll recently, which showed that support for freedom of the press and freedom of speech is very high. I think according to that poll, 91% of Americans support free speech, and 89% of Americans support freedom of the press. But in that same poll, you had 29% of Americans who said that President Trump ought to be allowed to shut down CNN or the New York Times if they covered news in a way that he didn't like. So clearly, to the extent there's overlap there, a large percentage of people who say they are for freedom of the press don't understand what freedom of the press means. And we recently had this big dialogue about cancel culture, about whether free speech has been eroded on college campuses, about speakers who are allowed to speak. And it's become as discussions tend to be, a very politicized discussion. And we particularly had a lot of right-wing speakers who have been upset because they haven't been treated kindly as they see it, or in other cases think they have been prohibited from speaking. And you had, which reached its sort of zenith a couple of years ago at the University of California, Berkeley, where what's the name, Yiannopoulos, was scheduled to give a speech, and he was given the biggest venue at the university. A lot of people came in from outside the college campus and created trouble. There were explosions that took place on campus. It was a big disruption. The police authorities decided to shut down the event, so that particular speech never took place. And Milo Yiannopoulos went on the air and said the University of California is anti-free speech, and and then you have people like Ann Coulter who were also screaming that they were being, there's free speech rights were being prohibited by the college campuses. Well, it's kind of ridiculous to think that and people like Ann Coulter and Milo Yiannopoulos are basically saying that they are being prohibited from speaking. I mean, clearly they're not, because we know who they are and we know exactly what they have to say. So no one's prohibiting their free speech. But it was this series of actions that led our current president to issue an executive order ordering universities to effectively do what they were already doing, which is to obey the law. But it gave him the occasion to make a lot of statements about how he's for free speech. And the Republican Party in this last convention had a big convention where you had several speakers, whose whole argument was that they're now the party of free speech. Well, they're the party of free speech because they're against people who don't like, who try to oppose Republicans saying certain things, not because this is the same party that saw nothing wrong with the president shutting down a demonstration so he could march through Lafayette Square and hold up a Bible. So there's a lot of misunderstandings and a lot of hypocrisy when it comes to that whole issue of cancel culture, what can be allowed, what cannot be allowed. And one of the points that I make is that to the extent it's a problem on college campuses, and it certainly happened in cases where it is a problem, it's largely correcting, and you've had, at the same time you had a lot of students who had problems with certain speakers. You also had the University of Chicago come up with a set of principles and a set of rules underscoring that their adherence to free speech principles, which a lot of universities have signed on to. And I don't think the big problem with free speech in that sense is college campuses. What I do say about college students, though, comes from a study that was done, a series of studies actually, done at Stanford, which basically get less to the issue of speech and more to the issue of objective thought, and reasoning, and in the internet age, and they would show groups of students incidents that were from the internet, which were basically hoaxes. And evaluate how they regarded these things, and they would also gave them the tools to search the internet and easily discover that these things were hoaxes, but most of the students just accepted this as reality, as opposed to exercising their independent thought, and their ability to look a little deeper and find out that what they were seeing was not really fact at all. So part of my discussion, is that we don't, the whole argument for free speech includes the assumption about critical thinking. It includes the assumption that we are a society where that value is established and where people are capable of critical thought, and that if you have critical thought, you can judge arguments and decide which is the best. You can weigh contesting facts and decide which are real facts and which are fake facts. We seem to be deficient in our ability to inculcate that among large parts of our population. And other than improving our educational processes, I'm not quite clear how you correct for that.
Well, there is an effort to do education. I think it's called Checkology, to do education of young people on how to analyze the information that they're getting from the many different sources that they have. We do have a question from one of our Politics and Prose readers who, in the context of hate speech, asks about the approach of the European Union rules. Have you had a chance to familiarize yourself with those at all?
Sure.
Because he asks if such laws might be possible in the United States.
The short answer is that'd be more difficult in the United States. The difference in the United States and say UK is that UK doesn't have a First Amendment. And so the government is perfectly within its rights to limit speech as it sees fit, and in accordance with some of the principles of the European Union, does so. So they're much harder on hate speech in Europe than they are here. we would have to assess our relationship to the First Amendment and what we're willing to accept and not in order to have the same, anything approaching the same level of regulation that they have in Europe. But the other thing is that we are a different kind of society. I mean, we are a society that's defined ourselves by defending, to use the term that's been used in several cases, the speech that we hate. And we've made that a sort of principle of our identity as a people and as a nation. And we're probably not going to give that up, even though many people are very unclear on what that means. So I don't see us evolving into a form of Europe when it comes to that. But I do think we have issues of our own, which we need to get our collective heads around.
Do you think that President Trump has abused his both his bully pulpit or his rights to as a citizen to engage in free speech?
I'm not so sure he's abused the right of free speech. I think he's ignored the separation of powers, and he's tested it to the limit. And so he simply ignores subpoenas. He ignores laws, and then lets the courts sort it out. But by the time the court sorts it out, he's already done what he wants to do, which in many cases is to violate the law with no repercussions. And that's not only an issue of speech. I mean, it's an issue of how he's treated immigrants. It's an issue of and refugees in particular, and asylum seekers. It's an issue across the board. He has I think very little respect for the institutions of government. I think though, what he has done with speech is very interesting, because he has made the government a producer of false speech in a way that no other government has done. I mean, everybody has told lies, every politician has told lies, but not to the extent that Trump has, and has not forced governmental bodies to do so to the extent that Trump does. That's certainly an abuse of power, and it's hard to call it even an abuse of his right to free speech, because that's not free speech he's exercised. He's exercised his right as the chief executive of the country in a irresponsible way, but it certainly has consequences on speech, and it undermines the whole argument that was made by the justices back in the day, that good speech automatically drives out bad, and that truth automatically drives out untruths. If in fact the government itself is the creator of these false facts and is the chief exponent of false truths, of lies, how does that self-correcting mechanism occur? It's hard to see how it does.
I think I have one more question. And you open your book writing about Charlottesville, and in your conclusion, you wrote about the uprising in response to the murder of George Floyd. And you observed that the people are uniting, and you said that they are challenging unexamined assumptions in the quest to live together in harmony and respect. And I was wondering what the unexamined assumptions about free speech are of those who have marched for justice for George Floyd and all of the men and women like him. What are the unexamined assumptions that they should be challenging?
I'm not sure I have a set of assumptions they should be challenging, but I think that the large assumption that speech in and of itself was going to correct all these wrongs of society was and is naive, and that there are other avenues from which one can seek equity and ought to.
Well, Ellis, this time has gone so quickly, and I've enjoyed so thoroughly talking with you about your very stimulating book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. And I wanted to turn the microphone over then to our host, Bradley Graham of Politics and Prose. And thank you for the opportunity to speak with you this evening.
Thank you, Eric. It's been a pleasure.
And thanks to both of you, Ellis and Eric, for really a very informative discussion about free speech, which clearly has become a more complicated and controversial issue. To everyone watching, a reminder that you can find a link in the chat column to purchase Ellis's book, The Short Life and Curious Death of Free Speech in America. And from all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.